Welcome to the Photography Basics course. This course is intended to give just a basic overview of the foundational principles of photography to get you started. This outline highlights what we'll be covering throughout the course. You'll understand how to use a camera, how the camera works, the various settings, and things to keep in mind. So how does a camera work? So today we have three examples. This is an old film camera. This is a newer, but not that new, mirrorless camera. And this is an old digital SLR camera. Now, going back to the really old film camera, pull it off. This is actually the lens. This is the camera body. There's actually a mirror here, which allows you to see through the viewfinder, which is here at the back. And through a mechanism here, the pentaprism shows what's going on through the mirror, through the lens. That allows the photographer to see exactly what the lens is seeing. Now, in order to capture the image that the photographer is seeing, when you take the image, it would actually flip the mirror up and expose the film, which would be loaded in at the back, but it would be right behind the mirror. That's actually how you would take a photograph. Now, let's put this back here. Now, when you move over to the digital SLR, what actually happens is that we flip this here. Behind the mirror is a image sensor. So it's a digital image sensor, which will then capture the image in the same way that the film would have captured the image in this old film camera. But the basic concept is the same. There's still a lens, there's still a camera body, there's still some mechanism to actually capture the image. Now, as we move over to mirrorless cameras, what has happened is that there's no longer, a mirror involved. That is actually just the image sensor. Now, this camera appears to have, a viewfinder, but it's still an electronic viewfinder. This viewfinder here actually looks straight through, but it doesn't actually show what is going on through the lens. Now you switch it to a digital mode, and in that digital mode, it's basically just showing the same thing that you would see on the back of the screen. We can set this to auto. Right, so now it's looking at that. So whatever you're seeing on the screen here, you'll see through the viewfinder, which is exactly what the digital image sensor is seeing. Now, at a high level, that is how a camera works. There are various settings such as the shutter speed, the aperture, which control just how much light gets to the image sensor. Once you control the amount of light that gets to the image sensor, and you control the focus of the image and what you're trying to focus on, that's essentially how you're taking a picture. Okay, so now let's talk about what exactly is a camera lens. Now, I think we touched on this earlier. Camera lens is this component here. This helps to guide the light on its way to the image sensor. Well, in the digital SLR image sensor, in previous cameras, it would be on its way to the film. Now, if you look at this, there are different settings here. This is actually, this lens is pretty old, but this is for focus. And focus is often, measured on these older lenses in what you might call distance, because essentially you can focus on things that are close, and as you change it, it focuses on things that are farther away. Now, you also have aperture, which this section here changes. We'll explain this in more detail in later sections. Let's rest this here. This Fujifilm lens, it's similar to that lens. You can actually control the aperture here, the focus here. Now, Lots of newer lenses don't have the aperture control on the lens itself. It's a setting control from the camera, and they have this for focus. Most new cameras utilize autofocus, so the focus will be set automatically depending on the subject that you're focusing on. Look at it here. See, this actually is the, if I can choose here, and then when I press the shutter halfway, whatever is in focus, it will select that item, and you can take a photo of it. Now, there are different types of lenses. We'll go into it in more detail in a later video, but you have zoom lenses and prime lenses. These three lenses are prime lenses. It's a 50mm prime lens, a 35mm prime lens, and I think this is also a 50mm prime lens. So the lens basically just helps to focus the image onto whether it's film or onto the image sensor in the camera. In a digital SLR or a film camera, as you're changing focus, you can actually look through the viewfinder and you can see exactly what is being focused on. Okay, so now we're going to talk about focal length. And we spoke briefly about this earlier, but essentially this 35mm here on the lens, this is the focal length of this lens, as is the 50mm on this lens. Now I dropped this very basic example to highlight the differences. Now, given that, a camera is a set distance from a subject, if you were to have a zoom lens or change the lens to differentiate between 85mm, 50mm, and 35mm, in this case, we've had just one lens, which is 35. This lens would be a 50mm. So if we put this lens on this camera, which you could do via an adapter, this will be the difference in what the camera is actually seeing. So you realize so the green lines here are the 85mm, the blue lines are the 50mm focal length, and 35 the pink lines. And these aren't geometrically accurate. This is just to give you an idea of the difference. Each camera with each lens, there'll be differences. And if you're talking about a full frame camera versus a APS-C size camera, this is actually a full frame camera. This is an APS-C size camera. So there'll be differences there, but we'll cover that after. Now, very basic, at 85mm, it'll be very zoomed in on the subject. So if this really was a person, you would only be seeing their torso. You can, we'll just pretend as if, I'll pull another lens out here. Yep, so as this is wide, this is 35, this is 50, the lens goes out more, you're zoomed in more. This doesn't go up to 85, but assuming that it did go up to 85, as you turn it again, it will be zoomed in even closer. Now, because it's so zoomed in, once you're, say you're at 85, the background will actually appear to be closer to the subject. And it will also create a compression effect that will allow the background to be blurred more. So the background, the higher the number here, so the longer the focal length, the more compression will occur in the image. The closer something in the background will appear to be to the subject, and the more out of focus it will be. That's kind of what we refer to as the background blur. Now, as you change it from, say, 50mm, from 85mm to 50mm, you'll be able to see more of the subject. The things in the background won't appear to be as close as they were before at 85mm, and there'll be less background blur. Now, as you move from say 50mm to 35mm, the same thing will happen. You'll be able to see more of the subject. The background will not appear to be as close as it did when you were using 50mm. Now, somewhere around 35mm or 50mm on a full frame camera, Some argue that that is the closest to a natural looking perspective of the human eye, but that's a separate topic. Now, when you're choosing your subject, this will help you to choose which lens you'd like to use. Now, you'll also be able to, because as you see here at 85 millimeters, if you were to take the camera and move it way back, say in this direction, move it all the way back, you would eventually still be able to cover the same subject at 85 millimeter, because eventually the field of view would have expanded enough to do it. You could have a challenge if you did not have enough distance. So if you're indoors, you'll find it's very difficult to use lenses with longer focal lengths, and it's easier to use them with, shorter focal lengths, I say 35 or even 23 or 16 millimeters, in which case it would be really wide and it would be very easy to get, a very wide angle indoors. Even your cell phone camera has a millimeter rating. Now that millimeter rating is actually relative to the size of the image sensor. Now an APS-C size sensor in this camera is actually smaller than the full frame sensor in this camera. Most of the time when we're referring to the millimeter of the focal length, while this is 35 millimeters, like if there's another lens that I have, not sure where it is, which is, here it is actually. So this is a 35 millimeter Canon EF lens, which will fit directly onto this camera. Now this is an APS-C size sensor, just like this camera. So what actually happens is that the 35 millimeter lens on an APS-C size camera becomes longer due to the crop factor. Now that, just to really simplify that, once the image sensor in the camera, like these two, is smaller than, say, a full frame image sensor, it has a crop factor. This is considered just to be like 1. This is 1.5 and this is 1.6. Now, if you were to try to get the same equivalent field of view, let's move this out of the way, the same equivalent field of view of this camera with a 50 millimeter lens for this camera, because it's 35, it's actually going to be 35 times 1.5, which is about, I think, 52.5 millimeters, something along that range. So the look through this camera should actually be very similar from a field of view perspective as the look through this camera. Now the math of all this isn't that important. The important thing is that whether you're using this camera or a camera like this, you understand what lens you might need for your camera. And you could play around with different lenses. Most cameras come with something like a kit lens, something like this, which goes all the way from 16 to say 50 or 15 to 45, in which case you can play with the various focal lengths if you wanted to get a prime lens. Now I'm going to, let's shift this page over. Okay, so this is the difference I was talking about here between APS-C and full frame. Alright, so I'm going to use this lens as an example. This is actually a, let's put it here to settle. This is a 35 millimeter Canon EF lens. Now, this Canon EF lens will fit both on this camera as well as on this camera. This is an old Canon Rebel XTI. Now, limited space, I'll use this camera to explain. This camera is pretty similar to the old Canon Rebel camera. Now you can actually use an adapter and attach this lens to this camera as well. Now when you do that, because of the crop factor of the lens, the effective focal length in full frame terms will end up being 52 millimeters, because this would be equivalent of this APS-C camera here with the smaller with the smaller sensor, and for on a full frame camera with a 50mm lens, it will be exactly 50mm. Now we're talking about 35, so it will be exactly 35mm. To give you a practical example, if we assume that these are all just a bunch of balls, like see we have, because of the more constrained field of view, assuming that they're the same distance apart, at 35mm on an APS-C camera, it will be more zoomed in. And see here, we only have, basically, I guess you could say two, like one ball here and half of this and half of this. Whereas on a full frame camera, you actually have 1, 2, 3, 4 in the field of view. Now again, this isn't a technically accurate description. This is just an example. Once you play with different focal lengths on different lenses, it will make more sense. This is especially important if you're doing, events or weddings, and you have to have an idea of where you'll be located as a photographer to know what focal length you'll need depending on the number of subjects. You wouldn't want to have a case where, there'll be a group of, say, 10 people, but based on your lens and where you'll be, you just won't be able to capture them. Or the focal length it's so wide that they'll be really small in the frame. Again, for events, you might want to have a zoom lens, just for the sake of flexibility. So to illustrate focal range, I'm going to be taking some images using a 16 to 50mm lens on the X Pro 2, which is a APS-C camera, and you'll get a feel as to what we've been demonstrating earlier. Anyway, that is focal length. Okay, now we're going to talk about zoom lenses versus prime lenses. Now we've been talking a lot about prime lenses, which is you have the 35mm, 50mm, and again this is 35mm on a crop sensor here, which you know what, we'll talk about camera mounts just to jump in here. So this is a Fuji X mount. These three lenses are all Canon EF mounts. Different camera brands each have their own mounts, and in some cases you can get adapters which would say allow this Canon EF lens to work on this Fuji X mount. It doesn't necessarily go both ways all the time, but you can check to see if a lens from another manufacturer can work on your camera. Often when they do that, there are certain features like autofocus that may not work, or even manual focus for like STM lenses. The focus might not work because there are no electronic contacts. We've kind of sidetracked a bit, so we'll come back to the original subject here, which is zoom lenses. Now, the only difference is that a zoom lens has a focal range from one number to another, whereas a prime lens only has one focal range. So whereas this only has 35mm, this only has 50mm, this only has 35mm, this lens actually has a range all the way from 17mm to 40mm. And you can actually see Um, Here, you're actually choosing the focal range, and the lens does move. Some lenses, like this one, it'll basically stay within the body of the lens as it moves. However, some other lenses it will zoom, such as the let's actually bring this out. This is a Fujifilm zoom lens, really cheap plastic lens. See? Yep, it'll go all the way out. So this is probably a lot more cumbersome. These lenses tend to be larger than just the prime lenses. Because a prime lens is focused on just one focal length, you have various glass elements and so on that make up the lens. These manufacturers, they're often able to optimize the image quality of a prime lens as opposed to the image quality in the zoom lens. That being said, you can have really expensive zoom lenses that are as sharp or even sharper than prime lenses. So here, once you can change the zoom, see the very basic concept. You're influencing what's coming through here, then coming through here, then getting to the image sensor in the camera. Okay. Okay, so what is exposure? Now, exposure is a combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And I shouldn't say it's a combination of that. Exposure is really, what the image sensor is capturing. Now, to get what you might call a correct exposure or a preferred exposure would be basically adjusting the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to the extent that the image looks the way you would expect it to look. Now, I've also included available light because the available light, it actually changes constantly unless you've controlled the lighting. So if you've gone into a room where you've blocked out all the windows and it's completely dark, and then you start using artificial lighting, turning on lights, and you basically control the light to the point where you like, then you could say that that available light, or I guess that's that light that you're creating is a constant, so you don't need to worry about it, and then you can focus on adjusting the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO to get the ideal exposure, which shows what you might like. Now, if you're outside, and say it's a cloudy day and it's constantly shifting between, cloudy and sunny, the available light is actually constantly changing. Now, our human eyes will automatically compensate for this and won't realize it, but it's changing constantly. And if you were to manually fix the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO on a camera, you would realize that as various subjects are, moving from between being in the shade versus being in the sun, and the constantly changing conditions throughout the day, every single image would look different. So that's just something to pay attention to, when you're photographing outdoors, and also to give you an idea of what exposure actually is. So, we're gonna go into shutter speed, aperture, and ISO in detail in subsequent videos. Okay, now we're going to talk about aperture. Now, the aperture of a lens is actually, there's an actual, what you might call an iris in the lens, similar to the human eye, and it actually is like opening and closing as needed to let in more light or less light. And, we've spoken about exposure before. It's kind of like how bright or dark the image is, and to control that, one way of controlling it is to adjust the aperture, which will let in more light or let in less light. Now, here on this camera, we can adjust it on the lens, which, as I pointed out before, that's not the case on all lenses, but at least on these Fujifilm lenses, most of the higher end ones, it's the case. Now, if you look through here, I'll press it halfway. Right now it's at f2, which is the widest aperture, which lets in the most light. As we go over to, say, we're at f4, you should see, it's actually more closed in. As we go to f8, it should be more closed in again. So we go over to f11, it's more closed in. And then we go over to f16, it's again more closed. So, you actually can choose just how much light you let in. Now there are other effects to the aperture itself in addition to just how much light, and in some cases you can set auto and the camera will decide how much. Now again, I have a little illustration here to kind of guide us. Now these are assuming that a focal length of 35 millimeter in both of these examples, same type of camera, whether it's full frame or crop sensor, it doesn't matter, the concept is the same. So we're going to talk about something that we call the focal plane. Now at f2, which we spoke about here, you'll have a narrower focal plane. So when you have a narrow focal plane, that's what creates those images where just the subject is in focus, but the background is out of focus. And what you can safely say, at least on these lenses, is that the smaller the number, which is the wider the aperture, the narrower the focal plane will be, and the more out of focus the background will be. Now, if this example here, this is the camera, this is the tripod, this is the ground, this is the tree, it's actually a chair. It's the same chair in both examples, tripod, camera in both examples. At f2, if you focus on the chair, again, this isn't geometrically accurate, this is just an example. You could assume that the focal plane will be between, say, these two lines, which would mean that the chair would be in focus, but the tree will be out of focus. Now, the further back the tree is, the more out of focus it would be. Now, if you were to change the aperture, it actually can affect just how narrow the focal plane is. So if you had a lens that went down to say 1.2, it could actually be so narrow that you could focus on the back of the chair and not be able, and the front will be out of focus because the focal plane will be so narrow. It'll be between it'll cover just the back of the chair alone. Now in this example here, we've moved it up to f8, right? Now in f8, if we remember correctly, it's really close down. You're not letting in as much light as you were before, but you actually have a wider focal plane. Now, for it to shift to here, there's also, this works in conjunction with the focus itself, the point that you're focusing at. So the point that you're focusing at is often in the middle of the focal plane. So in this case, if you focused on something like maybe a branch in the middle of the tree, then it would expand out to cover both sides, right? So here in this case at f8, and again this isn't geometrically accurate, there are cameras and lenses you could focus at f8 and the chair would still be out of focus, or parts of the tree would still be out of focus even if you focused on something right here. But for this example, we're going to assume that the focal plane at f8 at this 35 millimeter range, at this distance between the camera and the subject, this will be the focal plane, in which case the chair will be perfectly in focus, the tree and everything will be perfectly in focus. So sometimes when you take a photograph, the closer you get to a subject, the narrower the focal plane will become. So even at f8, if you were to move the camera right here and focus on the chair, the focal plane could end up getting so narrow because of the distance that the tree starts to become out of focus again. So that's something to bear in mind, and it also goes the further you are away, which is why if you had limited light, you could technically with a f2 lens focus at infinity if you're taking something like a landscape shot where everything really is out in the distance, and because it's so far away, the focal plane is expanded enough to cover the entire background. Now this will require some practice to really master, but this is covering the basic concept of what is happening as you change your distance from the camera to the subject, as well as changing the aperture on the lens. So the takeaways from here is that changing the aperture on the lens will basically let in more light or let in less light, and it will also affect the focal plane, what is in focus, depending on the distance of the camera to the subject. I'm going to talk about shutter speed. Now, The shutter speed is simply, actually, let's go back a bit. In the camera itself, there is actually a shutter that kind of opens and closes for a specific period of time, and the sensor is exposed for that period of time. Now, in this camera here, remember we actually have, we'll show it, we have an exposed image sensor. Now, if you're using an electronic shutter, it will simply make the sensor active for that period of time and then, deactivate it after. If you're using an electronic shutter, something actually comes down and closes. You probably shouldn't do this, but hey. Yep, there it is. And that's actually the shutter opening and closing. And if we were actually to go to us, that was set to 1/25th of a second. I'm going to move to a slower shutter speed. Move it down again. You see it's actually opening and closing for longer and longer periods of time. And that's basically, let me not get dust on here, but put this back on. So turn this back on. So that was actually, like a 2-second shutter speed. I'm going to move it back to 1/25th of a second. Now, the same thing is happening here, but it's actually behind the mirror. Now, when you take the image on a digital SLR, it actually flips the mirror up, exposes the sensor for that fraction of a second. There's also a shutter in there as well that will go up and go down. So these shutter speed settings are just, they're measured in 1 something of a second. Say this is 1/25th of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second. Again down here, 1/60th of a second, 1/30th of a second. This camera, you can see it's pretty much the same. It's 1/25th of a second, sorry, here. And that's just another means of controlling just how much light gets to the image sensor. Now, because you're actually exposing the image sensor for that period of time, whether what you're capturing is blurred or not is dependent on how fast the subject is moving. So let's say that you moved it down to one of the slower ones, like what we did earlier. Say it was open for like even half a second. If it's open for half a second, if there is, and it's capturing, just leaving it open, if there is movement in that time that the sensor is actually capturing that image for that half a second, there will actually be motion blur. And at night, it could manifest as light trails. That's how you get some of these fancy images that have light trails of cars on a highway, or just an image appears to be everything is sharp except one person that's jumping or running. That's by using a shutter speed that's slow enough to capture the motion. Now, there isn't really a rule of thumb per se, because everything moves at different speeds. If you wanted to freeze a sports car running at a high speed on a track, you'd have to use a much higher shutter speed than you would if you're just photographing someone sitting stationary in a chair. So if they're stationary in a chair, sure, they may move, they may blink, their hands may move very slightly, but that would be so slow, and you could tell them not to move, so you wouldn't need that higher shutter speed. There is a relative rule around how high a shutter speed you should have if you're hand holding, and again, this is just a guide, if you will. It's something that you'll have to practice with each lens and each camera. So like in full frame terms, if the shutter speed is if you're using a 50mm lens and you're hand holding it, it should be at least 1/50th of a second. Now, what you'll find is that as you're, say physically holding the camera, it's still, even though you're trying to hold it steady, it's still moving very slightly as you take an image, right? Now, this one here is actually trying to focus. So if at the point where you take an image, it was moving ever so slightly, what would happen is that it would still be blurred just from your motion, not necessarily from the motion of the subject if the shutter speed was set too low. So you'll have to play around with each lens and camera to see just how steady you can hold it and what the lowest shutter speed you can use. Now, the longer the lens, the more, and again, you can think of it as the longer the lens, the more pronounced movement becomes. So movement at 100 millimeter, if you're using a 100 millimeter lens, it's going to be much more pronounced at 100 millimeter than it will be if you're shooting that same scene at 50 millimeters. So that's really shutter speed at a high level. You will have to practice with your specific camera and lens to determine just how low a shutter speed you would like. Now, if you're trying to capture waterfalls, a lot of those things you want to have as low a shutter speed as possible. And if you don't have anything like a tripod is recommended for situations like those, but if you don't have a tripod and you're hand holding, you might want to use an image stabilized lens or a camera with in-body image stabilization, in which case, in-body image stabilization, you'll see there's a feature on some cameras. The sensor in the camera is actually moving ever so slightly to try and compensate for the movement of the camera itself. So as the camera is moving, the sensor is trying to offset that motion to make it as smooth as possible. So that, in combination with image stabilized lens, usually you're able to capture images at much slower shutter speeds, or even if you're recording video with your camera, you can do it without having additional stabilization like a gimbal. And if you were trying to capture or freeze high speed motion, like again a car on a track, or if somebody was jumping and you want to freeze them in the air as if they're frozen, so you need to use a higher shutter speed. You will probably have to play around with the shutter speed settings, and while you're adjusting shutter speed, also adjust the aperture and ISO in order to ensure that you have enough light or you don't have too much light. Because again, as you increase the shutter speed, your sensor, as we showed earlier, it's actually open for less and less time as the shutter speed is increased, which means less and less light is getting to the image sensor. Now, if less light is getting to the image sensor, you'll have to basically increase the ISO, which, not the ISO, the aperture. Use a wider aperture will allow more light into the image sensor. If you're already at the widest aperture, like on this lens of f2, your only other option if you want to use a higher shutter speed would be to increase the ISO, which may introduce additional grain, but we're going to talk about that in a subsequent video. Okay, now we're going to talk about ISO. Now, the ISO is, again, I don't think there's a defined standard going from one camera to another, but it ranges generally between, say, 100 and 12,800 for reasonable values, going up to over 100,000 or more for more sophisticated cameras. Now, the lower the value, the less sensitive to light the sensor will be, and the higher the value, the more sensitive to light the sensor will be. Now, if you're using a higher ISO, you'll be able to use faster shutter speeds, or even less smaller apertures. So why would you really bother to set the ISO too low? Now, the higher the ISO, the more grain will be in the image. The lower the ISO, the cleaner the image will be. So just from an image quality point of view, you'll always want to use the lowest possible ISO. So on this camera here, you'll see it's actually changes in a weird way. I mean, 200 is I guess the base for this camera, and I think for these cameras here, it's about 100. It's not very clear. You can change to, let's go back here, 100. See, 160, 200. You can go ahead and change it to various values. See, its high is 3200, because back in, 2003 or whenever this old Canon 5D Classic came out, that high of 3200 would make the image extremely grainy. And I personally never tried to go above 800 on this camera just to maintain a level of image quality that wasn't too grainy. Newer cameras tend to improve on just how high an ISO you can go. So this camera, I mean, if I was taking a photo for Instagram, I'd be okay going up to 6400. In some cases, I'd go up to 3200 if it was for a small print, maybe. But it depends on on the camera. The, you'll see as cameras get more and more advanced, newer cameras tend to some even have reasonably clean ISO at 6400 if you're printing on a poster. And again, image quality is a bit subjective. If you're printing something for a poster, chances are it'll be so far away that you'd be able to get away with a lot of grain, as opposed to an image that something that you'll put in your house and you can actually go up really close to. I'll kind of show some examples of various ISO settings, but the general objective is ISO as a means of controlling exposure. You'll want to keep it as low as possible. Now, if you're dealing with professional cinema video cameras, there's a bit of a difference there where they may have a base ISO, which might be 800 and say 3200, and the closer you get to that base ISO, that base ISO tends to have less noise than the other ISOs, which is a bit different for photography. Pretty much the lower the ISO, the cleaner the image. There's also a dynamic range that can be affected by ISO, especially as you get into these hybrid cameras, where as you're at say 800 or 3200, there could be more dynamic range than the other ISOs. This is going to vary from camera to camera, so you're really going to want to just try to play around or even do some research and get an understanding of what is ideal for your camera in various situations. So what is white balance? Now the white balance is actually the white point of an image, and getting this correct can affect how the image looks. So if the white balance is off, or I should say not correct, the image could end up being, appearing too blue, or the tones can be too warm. Now, when you're actually purchasing a bulb for your home, you'll see different Kelvin ratings, say 2700 Kelvin, which is basically a warmer bulb, or 3000 Kelvin, or they may go up to like 4500 Kelvin, or 5000 Kelvin, which is closer to, you may label it as daylight or natural white, or 5600 Kelvin, which I think is probably more accurately sunlight. And then it gradually gets, as it gets higher, it gets cooler. Like if you go up to 7000, it will appear more and more blue. Now, depending on the lighting that you're using in your particular situation, you should align the white balance setting on the camera to that setting. Now, if you're not doing anything professional, most cameras will do a fairly good job of guessing the white balance, which is the automatic white balance setting, which is probably the default on most cameras. You'll notice this with skin tones, especially. If the white balance is set correctly, the skin tones will look accurate. If the white balance is even off slightly, the colors will start to shift, whether they're too blue or too warm. And in some cases, someone may deliberately make it warmer if that's the look that they're going for. But you want to at least know how to get an accurate white balance. So even looking here at the camera, each camera sets white balance differently. On this camera we have auto. There are 3 custom white balance slots. You can actually choose the actual Kelvin. So again, if you were to purchase a bulb that was say 5000 Kelvin, set the camera to 5000 Kelvin. Basically, for a light with that 5000 Kelvin light shined onto a subject, when you take the picture, this 5000 Kelvin setting it here should match the 5000 Kelvin of the bulb, and the skin tones of that person should be accurate. If you're mixing different lights, you would set the camera to the white balance of the primary light or the key light, or it depends on the look that you're going for. But essentially, you could have, that light which is the main light on the subject being matched to the camera. Let's say it's 5,000, and if there was another light set to another Kelvin, like say 3,000 or 4,000, that could have a different shade in the background, like maybe a bluer shade, because it's actually expecting 5,000. This is how a lot of different scenes can have various shades of light with different color temperatures kind of influencing the scene. So some YouTubers may have an entire section of the room kind of lit up in blue or lit up in orange or red or purple. But when you look at the subject themselves, their white balance, their skin tones look very accurate. Now, some cameras will be smart enough to detect the actual face and set the white balance accordingly. But depending on what you're doing, if you're really going to go into multiple light sources using different tones, like different light sources with different colors, you will want to set the white balance to match the light that's illuminating the primary subject. And again, this depends on what you're trying to do, unless you want the subject to be blue and something in the background to be, accurately colored. That's white balance at a high level. You should see some examples kind of sprinkled in here just to give some context. Okay, so we're going to talk about flash. Why would you use a flash? Now, remember earlier we spoke about the exposure being a balance of the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Now, what if you really wanted to use the lowest possible ISO to gain the highest quality based on the subjects you're shooting? You actually want to use, aperture 5.6 because you needed a wide enough focal plane in order to capture all the subject, and you wanted to use a particular shutter speed, whether it's say 1/25th of a second to at least capture minimal movement. Now, if you needed some additional light, you would need to use a flash or some other kind of lighting. You have strobes. This is a regular Canon flash unit. Let's turn this on. So if after you've set all your settings and your scene is still underexposed, basically too dark, you can't see all the subjects, you might need to use something like a flash, which basically gives a pop of light. You also have other lighting for like continuous video light that will give you a constant stream of light, which may be easier when you're planning a photographic scene to see just how the light is falling. You also have different light modifiers like soft boxes and so on, which allow you to shape and guide the light and soften the light so that it doesn't fall too harshly on subjects. While this flash is designed to be connected to, let's turn it off actually, I can leave it on to say a camera like this. You do have adapters that basically remote adapters that would allow you to connect the adapter to the camera, connect to the flash, and you could put the flash in the corner. You might be able to, here it is, say point it up somewhere in a corner and take your image and have it bounce off a wall in a corner far away to create the look that you want. Because if you were to put, normally when you're dealing with flash, once it's on the camera pointing directly at the subject, the light tends to be too harsh. Unless it's more of like a fill and you've really turned it down, it'll often be too harsh and it'll create a very unflattering look. So you want to stay away from head-on flash as much as possible unless you know exactly what you're doing. It's more as a fill, and you can play around with it to see. So don't take my word for it. Play around with flash in different ways to see how it affects the subjects that you're capturing. Okay, so how do you get the images off the camera? Now, normally cameras will have a memory card. Well, this camera actually has two memory card slots. Pull it out. This is actually an SD card. This SD card Most computers have an SD card slot, or you can buy SD card adapters that will allow you to copy the images from the SD card onto your computer. This really old camera actually has what you might call this is a compact flash card. It's much larger. It's also much slower. So this is actually 30 megs per second versus 170 megs per second. So they're different speed SD cards. So when you're purchasing SD cards for your camera, you really want to pay attention to the speed. If it's a hybrid camera that does video, the higher quality video settings often require the higher end SD cards with faster speeds. Now, some cameras also have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth options that would allow you to pull the images from the camera while you're out in the field taking images. You'll still need an SD card or some kind of storage to store it on, but you wouldn't necessarily need to get to a computer. Some cameras will allow you to actually copy directly to an app on your phone, while you're out. So you could upload it directly to Instagram or some other social media platform. So now we're going to talk about image formats. Now, here on the Fuji camera, you have fine, normal, fine plus raw, normal plus raw, and raw. What exactly does this mean? Now, when you're actually taking photographs, it has to store it in a particular format on the memory card. Depending on the format that it's stored in, it may compress the picture. By compressing it, actually takes out parts of the image that it thinks are not relevant, and when you're looking at it, you might not be able to tell they've been removed in order to make the image smaller. Now, a raw image, which it's different camera manufacturers have different raw formats. Those raw images are a complete dump of what was captured by the image sensor in the camera. So it has all the detail of everything that was captured. Now you don't have focus detail. You can't change focus in a raw file, but it does have white balance detail. So you're able to, I shouldn't say white balance detail, but you're able to adjust white balance when you're post-processing. And this is very useful for photographers, because if you do get the white balance incorrect while you're shooting, you can actually adjust it. And we know that the white balance does affect the accuracy of skin tone. So if you're doing something like wedding or corporate events, unless you really trust the automatic white balance setting, or you have very controlled lighting and you're going to set the white balance manually, it's strongly recommended to use raw in all of those situations, because it will allow you to adjust the white balance in post. I'd argue if you were going through the trouble of setting up lighting, then you would probably be using raw anyway. Now, JPEG, it's actually a compressed format, and some cameras have different levels of compression, but essentially it'll make the file sizes smaller. And once you're using these smaller file sizes, you'll be able to take for the same size image card. And I think this camera has a 128 gigabyte. Is it 64 or 128? It could be 64. I can't remember, but whatever the size of the memory card, you'll be able to take more JPEG images on that card than you will raw images. I think we should be able to see that here as an example. So right now you see, well, you may not be able to see, but there's 1,942. I can take 1,942 medium-sized. Oh, I think it's set to raw plus JPEG. Let's set it to fine, which is fine JPEG. It's set to medium for the image size, because for JPEG, you can actually choose different image sizes. It's set to medium in this case. Some cameras have even like a small RAW, where you can use RAW but make it a smaller, like lower resolution version of RAW. Now, the resolution here, which is set to medium, affects this is a good example, it affects the number of pixels that are captured. So it could be 6,000 by 4,000, or it could end up being 3,000 by 2,000 if it's medium, versus say 6,000 by 4,000 if it's large. And you can actually see the different settings here. Now this 3.2, and I'm not sure if it's clear, but 3 3:2 versus 16:9. That's the aspect ratio, which is horizontal, how it scales horizontally versus vertically. So I mean, 3:2, and I'm gonna kind of 3:2 would be the, this is probably ratio of 3 to a ratio of 2. 16:9, actually, when you look at it here, you can't see, but it's actually, there we go. So it may not be clear from this image, but they're actually borders at the top and the bottom, because once you have 16 across by 9 as a ratio, they're actually borders at the top and bottom. Now, because there's less image being captured with that border being there, you'll be able to store more images in 16:9 format, which usually only for, say, JPEG options, versus if you're using 3:2. So you can see it here where in 16:9 you can store 5,150 large images versus 4,361 large images in 3:2 versus 16:9. And if you go down to a medium sized image, at 3:2, it's 8,600, or even 16:9, it's actually 10,300. Alright, so let's leave it at here, medium 3:2, which is 8,600. These are all JPEG settings, because we set it to fine. Let's actually change it to RAW. Now, by changing it to RAW, it's no longer, this image size option has gone away, because it's just going to capture all data, capture all data that the image sensor can see. So you can no longer change the size. Again, that's just for this camera. Some other cameras do have the option to capture like a smaller version of a RAW file. Now, you see here we actually have 2,506 images in RAW, so we can capture 2,506 RAW images in the space that's available on this memory card versus, let's go back to JPEG, where even in large, at a full 3:2, you could capture 4,300 images. You can capture a lot more. So space is the primary reason why someone might want to shoot JPEG over RAW. The other reason is that when you have a RAW file, this RAW file is almost like a like film that needs to be developed. So depending on how the camera presents the RAW file and which application you're using, the file, it may not necessarily look its best coming straight out of the camera. Most modern cameras look really good coming out of the camera, but it actually may not look its best, and you may need to tweak it. Now, some cameras actually, for the JPEG processing, they have some advanced processing which allows it to look pretty good out of camera if you're using JPEG. That might be a reason as well why some persons may want to use JPEG as opposed to RAW. If it's not that serious, if it's just a family gathering, you don't really plan to do any editing with it, you just want to copy straight off the camera and move it to wherever it is you're moving it to, then that might be a reason to use JPEG as well. Now, you should play around with your camera and the various settings and for your particular use case and determine what might be more ideal. Anyway, that's the differences between RAW and JPEG. Alright, now we're going to talk about practice methodology. Now, if you're learning photography, I think it's helpful to learn in a structured way, and that might be to tackle, aperture, exposure, and ISO one at a time. So what that might mean is, like on this camera here, locking ISO to 200, locking the shutter speed to, it's 60 or 1/25 of a second, and then play around with just the aperture, right? So play around with just one at a time so you can get a good idea of how it behaves, go in different lighting conditions. Sometimes, we hear that a lower ISO means that the sensor is less sensitive, but until you go from a bright room to a candlelit room at night, you really, sometimes it's hard to gauge just how much less light the sensor is capturing and just how far you may need to push something like ISO, or how wide an aperture you might need to then be able to see anything at all, as opposed to just having a pitch black image. So I'd say lock these different settings, play with them one at a time. So you lock ISO and shutter speed, play around with the aperture, then maybe lock aperture, play around, lock ISO, play around with the shutter speed, and then maybe lock both the aperture and the shutter speed and play around with the ISO. Some cameras, well, most newer cameras of this era anyway, would have an auto ISO setting. This camera's an auto ISO, this one does not. Depending on the camera brand, how you control these settings will actually be different. Now, this camera, generally there are a few things that are bit standard, such as M. The M is for manual, AV is for aperture priority, TV is for shutter priority. P, it will actually try to guess a reasonable aperture and shutter speed for the image that it's seeing based on what it thinks. Now on the Fujifilm cameras, it's a bit different. Now you can actually change the shutter speed at any time, but if you want it to be automatic, you can move this over to A. So moving this over to A and setting the aperture here, it will be similar to aperture priority on this camera because you're prioritizing the aperture, and the camera can then automatically decide what the shutter speed should be. If you have auto ISO, it'll probably decide what ISO should be as well, but I often hear we actually have the ISO set at 200, so it's fixed. This camera does not have auto ISO. It's the original Canon 5D Mark I. There's no auto ISO here. It's set to 100, but essentially, by having it set to aperture priority, I can change the aperture, and normally you'll actually see, let's see here, let's change it. The aperture number is changing, and it's automatically changing the shutter speed based on the exposure. It's like 1/30th of a second, if I'm seeing correctly. 1/50th actually. Yeah, and it basically the cameras will work the same. Even on this camera, you can actually set this to auto for the aperture, and then with this you can then choose which shutter speed would you like. And then again, remember with this camera, you can actually see here as you change it, it changes. Changing shutter speed here, it's automatically changing the aperture. It should be actually, can't see. Yep, and I found this your method of fixing one thing, going into different environments and playing around with the settings by fixing one. It gives you a thorough understanding of the camera, and you'll learn what the limits of the camera are, because every camera does have limits. I mean, the more expensive cameras have really high limits, so, or I should say, the limits are very low, so you'd have to go very far to reach the limits of the camera. But this will allow you to know when you walk into a particular situation just what the camera can and can't do. And if you're doing commercial events, you'll be able to plan ahead of time to determine, okay, what kind of hardware do you need in advance, if you need to rent additional gear, by knowing the limits of the gear that you do have. So this setting here of setting the aperture automatically, this is kind of like a shutter speed priority, which will be the same as TV here, because it's prioritizing the shutter speed, which, let's see here. Yep, so when we fit this dial now, it actually, you can change this and it will change the aperture automatically on the lens. Now, the P setting actually tries to decide on both the aperture and the shutter speed on its own, and that will be the same as maybe setting this to A here. Alright, so aperture is set to automatic, shutter speed set to automatic, and the camera has to decide. Now, some of these cameras, I said, have an auto ISO setting. That setting often will be, I'll show it to you here on this camera if you can see it. Let's choose auto 1. So it'll have a default sensitivity, a max sensitivity, minimum shutter speed. So different cameras will basically give you different options to determine how the auto ISO will work. But let's say that you've worked out that your camera is not really good past, say, I don't know, 6400, ISO 6400. You could set it there, and then no matter what, it won't go past 6400 when it's automatically trying to set the ISO. I guess in certain situations I'm okay with this 12.8, so I'll leave it at that. Again, you play around with the options available on your camera, and you'll become more familiar. If you are a professional or planning to be a professional, you should get to the point where when you see a scene, you can actually set the settings on the camera almost, just at glance. You shouldn't really be fiddling too much. You should really become one with the camera and have a thorough understanding of what setting is needed for that particular situation. And if you're not there yet, don't panic. It just comes with practice, and by carrying your camera into various lighting situations, whether it's you're waking up in the morning, you're looking outside, taking things at home. As you progress down into evening, when the light starts to fade, continuing to take various images and make a mental note of the settings that you have to start adjusting. And once you start getting into, pitch black situations where, maybe it's just candlelit or there's nothing at all, if there's even moonlight coming in, can you actually get a usable image? You should challenge yourself to see just how far you can push the limits of the camera. Most cameras have pretty high limits, even most entry-level cameras. It's just subject to you knowing how to pull that capability out of the camera. So I think that's pretty much the end of it at this point. So anyway, thanks for watching. Happy practicing.